Stay in the servants' hall until matters are sorted." The Countess of Maine spoke without lifting her eyes from her embroidery, and there was a faint, glittering pleasure in the way the words landed, the precision of a woman who has practiced cruelty as one practices the pianoforte. Charlotte Avery stood very still in the marble entry of Westmere Hall, her travel cloak still beaded with road rain, the polished black of her gloves dark to the wrists with mud. She did not curtsy. She did not speak. She let 1 half-second pass, long enough to register that the housekeeper at the far end of the hall had gone the colour of unbleached linen, and then she inclined her head, as though she had been welcomed. "Of course, my lady," she said. The Countess turned a page of her hoop. The stitch she set into the linen was a perfect French knot, white silk on white, ornamental and useless. Mrs. Penrose, hovering by the rosewood console, opened her mouth, shut it again, and produced something that was almost a sound. Charlotte caught her eye, gave the smallest possible shake of her head, and followed the housekeeper's reluctant arm toward the green baize door at the back of the hall. She had been on the road for 7 hours. She had counted the wax-sealed letter in her travel case 3 times, against the temptation to take it out and lay it on the inlaid table beside the Countess's tea tray. She had imagined, somewhere in the long blue-grey miles between Sevenoaks and Westmere, the ways this arrival might go. A reserved welcome, perhaps. A dignified one. In the worst case, a polite confusion. She had not imagined being directed to the servants' hall by a woman who had not yet asked her name. The mistake, Charlotte thought, as the green baize door swung shut behind her, was the woman's, not hers. And the Countess had not yet realized she had made it. The corridor on the other side of the door smelled of yeast and beeswax. Mrs. Penrose walked half a pace ahead, almost limping in her distress, her keys clinking softly against her bombazine skirts. At the second turning, she stopped and pressed a thin hand against the wall. "Miss Avery," she whispered, I cannot allow." "Of course you can," Charlotte said gently. "If you contradict her in the marble hall, I shall be sent to an inn at midnight with my trunks and a most colourful story. Take me to the kitchen, Mrs. Penrose." The housekeeper made a noise like a kettle deciding whether to boil. "It is not a kitchen for ladies." "Then it shall be educational. Lead on." Mrs. Penrose led on. The kitchen of Westmere Hall, when its baize door opened to admit them, was already at work for evening. A great range stood at the far wall, throwing out an honest, comfortable heat, and along the scrubbed deal table, a pair of kitchen maids were rolling out pastry under the brisk supervision of a broad-shouldered woman in a flour-dusted apron and a coral-red shawl. Above the dresser, a brass cage contained a grey African parrot, who put his head on one side as Charlotte entered, and remarked, with great clarity, "Position yourselves." "That is Wellington," said the cook, without turning around. "He was bought from a sea captain. He has opinions, but no manners." "He has more manners than several people I have met today," Charlotte said. The cook turned. She was perhaps 50, with the high colour of a woman who had stood next to a fire for 30 years, and considered the matter, on balance, to have been worth it. Her eyes flicked from Charlotte's mud-spattered cloak to Mrs. Penrose's stricken face, and read the whole story before either of them had spoken. In a thread of a voice, the housekeeper introduced Miss Avery, just arrived from Sevenoaks after a long journey. Mrs. Tobin made a small, considering sound and looked at Charlotte. She observed that the Countess had met Miss Avery in the marble hall, and Mrs. Penrose confirmed it. She observed that Miss Avery was now in her kitchen, and Mrs. Penrose confirmed that too. Mrs. Tobin did not say anything else. She simply pulled out the high-backed wooden chair nearest the range, the one with the worn cushion that was understood, throughout the lower household, to belong exclusively to herself, and gestured to it with a wooden spoon. "Sit," she said. "Mary, the brown teapot. Susan, a clean cloth and the tin with the seed cake. Annie, run up the back stair and tell young John he's to take Miss Avery's trunks to the blue room in the east wing this instant, because I should very much like to know what is keeping him." "I am quite content here," Charlotte said. "I'm sure you are, Miss Avery, but I'm not going to be." A small smile touched the corner of Charlotte's mouth. She sat. The chair was warm. The fire was honest. Wellington remarked, "Position yourselves," again, and Mrs. Tobin turned and pointed her wooden spoon at him with the absolute authority of a woman who had been outwitted by a parrot once and did not intend it to happen twice. "That bird," she said, "will be a soup before Christmas." "Position yourselves," Wellington observed gravely. Mary brought tea. Susan brought seed cake on a Delft plate. Charlotte unbuttoned her cloak. Its indigo lining showed only a little of its quality, but Mrs. Tobin's eye caught the hand-sewn silk braid at the collar, and her mouth tightened. She knew good work when she saw it. She knew, by 100 small signs, that the woman in the chair by her range had not been raised in a servants' hall. "Miss Avery," she said quietly, pouring tea with the thick brown teapot rather than the porcelain one. "The Duke is expected from London tonight. After supper, but before the moon comes up, if the roads have held. Do you wish me to send word to him at the gatehouse?" Charlotte considered it. "No," she said at last. "Let him come in his own time. I shall sit by your range, drink your excellent tea, and admire the manners of your parrot. I have travelled far. I am not too proud, Mrs. Tobin, to be tired." Mrs. Tobin set the teapot down. Her broad red hand rested for a moment on the back of the chair, almost on Charlotte's shoulder, almost not. "You eat that seed cake," she said, "and you tell me, when you are ready, how a young woman comes to ride 7 hours through November rain to be told to stay in the servants' hall." Charlotte looked into the brown teacup. The reflection of the firelight moved on the surface. Orange, then black, then orange again, like the swing of a door. "Because," she said, "today is the second day after the end of my mourning, and the first day I have been able to leave my father's house. And the man who invited me here did not expect me until tomorrow, and his mother does not yet know my name." Mrs. Tobin folded her arms slowly and looked at Mrs. Penrose, and Mrs. Penrose looked at the floor. "Position yourselves," said Wellington. For the first time, Charlotte laughed. It was a small, surprised, ragged laugh, the kind a woman makes when she has not laughed for several weeks and has forgotten how the muscles work. It was, she thought, an extraordinary laugh to have been delivered up by the kitchen of Westmere Hall on the same day the marble entry had refused her. The two halves of the house already disagreed about her. She wondered whether the master of the house, when he came, would take after the marble or the kitchen. She suspected, with a small leap of her ribs that she did not quite trust, that he would take after the kitchen. She drank her tea. The Duke of Westmere returned to his house at 9:30 that evening, and his mother did not come into the entry to greet him. She had already retired to a sitting room in the small upstairs apartment that had been made over to her at her son's elevation, and was reading aloud to herself from a French novel of the more decorous sort. She heard the wheels of his travelling chaise on the gravel and the call of the undergroom. She did not put down the novel. She had perfected the appearance of being unbothered by his comings and goings. It was the only fortress she had left, and she defended it with the discipline of a Roman. So it was only Mrs. Penrose who met him in the marble entry. Mrs. Penrose, who had been waiting in the shadow of the staircase for a full hour, listening for hooves. Adrian Hartwood, Duke of Westmere, was 28 years old, broad-shouldered enough to fill a coach door without performance, and tall enough that he had learned to drop his head a fraction when entering rooms his mother had not redesigned for him. His travelling coat was of plain, dark green wool, well cut and unornamented, and the rain on his shoulders had soaked through to the lining. His eyes were the warm, dark brown of seasoned oak, and there were 2 faint vertical lines between his brows that had been put there by the practice of paying attention. They deepened now, as Mrs. Penrose came down the last 3 steps too quickly. She told him there was something she must say before he went upstairs. He stopped, set down his gloves, and looked at her face. He bid her tell him. She gave it to him in fragments. Miss Avery's arrival that afternoon from Sevenoaks, 7 hours on the road, the Countess at her embroidery in the marble hall when the visitor came in, Miss Avery's cloak so road-marked that... And at the gentle correction of her name from his mouth, she steadied herself and said the rest plainly. His mother had told the visitor to stay in the servants' hall until matters were sorted. Adrian Hartwood did not speak for the time it took a clock somewhere down the corridor to strike the half-hour. The clock had been chosen by his late father. It had a particular small bronze chime he had heard for 28 years, and which had marked, in his memory, the hour he heard of his father's last illness, the hour he was made duke, the hour the bill for the relief of the Sevenoaks parishes had passed its second reading. He listened to it now, and laid down, in the same private ledger, the hour at which his mother had directed the woman he intended to marry to wait below stairs. "Where is she now?" he said. She is in the kitchen, sitting by the range. Mrs. Tobin has given her tea. She would not be moved upstairs, she said. Mrs. Penrose drew a long breath. She said she would not contradict the Countess in the marble hall. She said it would only become more colourful. Your Grace, she is sitting with us in the kitchen, as if it is the natural place for a woman to sit, and the maids cannot stop looking at her. I imagine they cannot. What shall I do? You shall do nothing, Mrs. Penrose, except follow me. I am about to do a thing the household will discuss for some years, and I should like a witness whose word will be believed. He shed his travelling coat into a footman's startled arms. He did not change his boots. He walked the length of the marble hall, past the inlaid table, past the half-finished embroidery hoop set down on a chair, past 2 centuries of family portraits hung by his grandmother, and pushed open the green baize door at the back, and went down the corridor to the kitchen. The conversation at the deal table cut off as if a string had been snapped. Mrs. Tobin straightened. The kitchen maids dropped half-curtsies with flowered hands. Wellington remarked, softly and with great seriousness, "Position yourselves." Charlotte rose from the chair by the range. She was, Adrian thought, extraordinary. She was extraordinary in the marble hall, and she was, somehow, more extraordinary here, in the firelight by Mrs. Tobin's range, with road mud still on the hem of her travelling gown, and her dark hair coming loose at the nape from a low coil set that morning before dawn. Her grey eyes, the grave, clear grey of a November river, found his face, and read his face, and decided, in the time it took him to cross the flagstones, that he was not angry with her. He saw the small breath she let out when she had decided that. He thought he might keep, in the same private ledger as his father's clock, the moment her shoulders had dropped. He took her hand. The hand was cold from the range door being open, and ink stained at the inside knuckle of the second finger, and steady. He raised it, very deliberately, and pressed his lips to the back of her glove. He held the kiss there a fraction longer than was usual, so that there could be no doubt in any of the 4 faces around the table about what he was doing. Lo, with the kiss still warm on the back of her glove, he begged her pardon. He should have been in the entry to meet her. He had been held 2 hours at the second toll on the London road by an overturned cart, and the boy he had sent ahead with word that he should be home tonight had evidently not arrived in time. Charlotte answered, just as quietly, that the boy had arrived. She rather thought he had been sent to the kitchens. A beat. Adrian's mouth turned up, very slightly, at one corner. That, at least, he allowed, was consistent. He turned toward the deal table, still holding her hand, and the kitchen looked at him with the steady alarm of people who suspect they are about to be asked to remember exactly what they have witnessed. "Mrs. Tobin," he said. "Mrs. Penrose, Mary, Susan, Annie. This is Miss Charlotte Avery, the only daughter of Sir Edmund Avery, late of Sevenoaks. She is in this house at my invitation. In the eyes of God and the law, she is the woman I shall marry by the end of the year, and she ought to have been received in the great drawing-room, with hot tea and a fire built up, and Mrs. Penrose calling for her box. Instead, she has been received by you, with hot tea and a fire built up, and Wellington. I am, on the whole, ashamed of half the house, and grateful to the other half. Mrs. Tobin, you have my thanks. Mary, you may go up to the blue room. and tell young John that if her trunks are not yet on the landing, he will be answering to me. Mrs. Penrose, will you please conduct Miss Avery to the Rose drawing room and ring for hot water in her dressing room? I shall join her there in 15 minutes. Mrs. Penrose answered her assent, and her face went from white to a sudden pink. Adrian instructed Mrs. Tobin that when Miss Avery had freshened, she would like the supper she had not yet had, a simple one, since she had been on the road since 10 that morning. Mrs. Tobin answered as though it had been arranged days ago. Soup and a chop and some of the apple pudding, with the brown teapot, not the porcelain. The brown teapot, Adrian agreed. He looked down at Charlotte. He was still holding her hand. He asked whether she would forgive him. Forgiveness, Charlotte returned, was a generous word, but she would consider the matter in the Rose drawing room, over the brown teapot, with seed cake. If forgiveness could be bought, she thought it should cost him a great deal of seed cake. He turned his head an inch toward Mrs. Tobin, who declared, before he could even ask, that there should be cake. Then he was encouraged, he said. He let her hand go. He bowed to her, in the kitchen, in front of the maids and the cook and the parrot and the housekeeper. And his bow was perfectly correct and a little, not quite, formal. Wellington remarked, into the silence that followed, that they should position themselves. Mrs. Tobin pointed her wooden spoon at the brass cage and informed the parrot, in the voice of a woman whose patience had finally been tried beyond the limits the King's English could express, that she would have him stuffed. Adrian's laugh was startled out of him. It cracked the room open. Mary giggled. Susan put her flower-white hand over her mouth. Mrs. Penrose's pink cheeks went pinker, and she made a curtsy to nobody in particular. And Charlotte put one gloved hand over her face, and her shoulders shook, very briefly. And then she straightened, and looked Adrian in the eye, and informed him, with perfect composure, that she believed she should like to see the Rose drawing room now. The Duke of Westmere said he believed he should like to take her there. He offered her his arm. She took it. They walked out of the kitchen, past the deal table and the great range and the brass cage, and down the corridor to the green baize door, and the door swung shut behind them, on the absolute silence of 4 servants, who had just received a story they would tell at every Christmas dinner for the next 40 years. The Countess of Maine, in her sitting room 2 stories up, turned a page of her French novel, and did not yet know that the small foundations under her had begun, very quietly, to shift. The Rose drawing room had been called the Rose drawing room for 60 years, and it had earned its name once. Old Lady Westmere, Adrian's grandmother, had liked the colour of dawn, and had had the panelling painted in a particular faint pink that turned, under candlelight, the warm cream of the inside of a shell. There were 4 long windows, draped now in rose brocade, gone discreetly thin at the cuffs, a wide hearth, 2 sofas, a small writing desk, and a portrait of the late Duke, Adrian's father, over the mantel. The fire had been lit half an hour. The room smelled of beeswax and wood smoke, and the faint dry sweetness of old roses. Charlotte, washed and changed into her amber wool, the one she had brought specifically for arrival, which lay still folded in tissue at the bottom of her trunk, because she had not foreseen arriving in November mud, stood at the fender, warming her hands. The amber of the wool caught the firelight, and threw it back in a way that made the room look briefly like September. Her hair had been recoiled. Mrs. Penrose had brought up the brown teapot with her own hands. Adrian came in without knocking. He had also changed. He was in a chocolate-brown evening coat over a cream waistcoat, and his hair was still damp from the basin he had bent over for one furious minute, before realizing that what he chiefly required was not water, but speech. He stopped just inside the door and looked at her in the amber wool by the fire, and forgot, for a moment, what he had come to say. She wore that colour, he told her, as if it had been invented for her. Mr. Wedgwood, Charlotte returned, would be flattered. He had thought he had invented it for cream jugs. She asked whether she might sit. He bid her sit, and said he would stand, because he did not know what to do with his hands at this moment, and he did not trust them not to seize her in some unbecoming way. She sat on the nearest sofa and tucked her feet under the brocade, with the small, economical movement of a woman who has been cold for hours and does not intend to admit it. He came as far as the hearth, leaned an elbow on the mantel, and looked into the fire instead of at her, because he did not yet trust himself to look at her. He had been thinking, he told her, about what to do with his mother, for most of the journey from the kitchen to the Rose drawing room, and indeed for most of the thinking of his life since he was 10 years of age. He said it without irony. Charlotte asked whether it would be impertinent of her to suggest he had been thinking about it the wrong way round. He told her to suggest it anyway. She did. He had been thinking about how to manage his mother. He should be thinking about who, in this household, he wished to be the mistress of it. Adrian turned his head slightly toward her. The 2 faint lines between his brows had returned. He told her, quietly, to go on. It was not yet her, she said. She had not yet stood up in church and signed her name beside his in the great book. Until that happened, the mistress of Westmere Hall, by old custom and by quiet practice, was his mother. That was the structure under which the housekeeper, the cook, the steward, the under-butler, the gardeners, and the grooms had all spent the last 20 years. It was the structure under which his mother had believed, that afternoon, that she had the authority to direct an unidentified young woman to the servants' hall. She had not been wrong about the structure. She had been wrong about the woman. She had been very wrong about the woman, he agreed. But not wrong about the structure, Charlotte returned. And until the structure changed, his mother would continue to make decisions on its authority. She would not always make them in the marble hall. Some of them she would make in writing, by the Morning Post, to people who mattered. Some she would make through Mr. Gable, his steward, Charlotte gathered, the one who would not look strangers in the eye when he spoke to them. Some she would make, simply, by what she did not say at dinner. He had turned fully to face her now. He asked her what she was proposing. She proposed, she said, that he do a small, dry, unromantic thing, and very soon, before the house had the time to settle into a new wrong shape. She proposed that tomorrow morning, before breakfast, his mother be informed by him, in writing, that the keys of the household, Mrs. Penrose's keys, the still-room key, the linen press key, had been transferred, on his authority, to a temporary trust held by Mrs. Penrose herself, until such time as the next mistress of Westmere was properly installed. Not to her, to Mrs. Penrose, so that there could be no doubt that he had not made her mistress in advance of marriage, but there could also be no doubt that the keys were no longer his mother's. The keys, she said, were the only true measure of authority in a country house. If the keys moved, everything else moved. He was silent for a long moment. Then he asked, very quietly, how she had come to know the structure of a country house this well at 26. She answered without preening. She had read every household manual in her father's surgery while she was waiting for him to come down to dinner during a long childhood. She had had no brothers, no governess after the age of 14, and a father who had believed in education by inappropriate book. She knew the structure of a country house. She also knew the structure of a parish vestry, of a small dispensary, of a Quaker meeting, and of a fraudulent insurance claim. She had read what was put in front of her. Adrian looked at her and did not say anything. After a moment, he came and sat, not on the sofa beside her, but on the low chair across from it, leaning forward, his elbows on his knees, his hands loosely clasped between them. His mother, he predicted, was going to find Mrs. Penrose with a new keyring at breakfast, and would know exactly what had happened, and would not forgive him. Probably not, Charlotte allowed. But she would respect him, and for the next 2 months she would pay attention to what she did, because she would know what she did had consequences. And in 2 months, he asked, what then? In 2 months, Charlotte returned, the two of them would be married. She would take the keys from Mrs. Penrose. His mother would move into her widow's apartments at the end of the east wing, with the maid she liked, the books she liked, a fire kept by her own footman, and an allowance large enough to be generous, and small enough to be felt. He looked up at her and observed that she had thought about this in some detail. She had had a wedding planned to a duke for a little under 2 months, she answered. She had not been idle. For the second time that night, she heard him laugh. It was a brief, startled sound, much like his laughter in the kitchen. The laugh of a man whose chief habit was duty, and who had not known there was a corner of his life still capable of unmarked surprise. Then it stopped, and his face went serious in the firelight, and he leaned a little further forward. He spoke her name. She answered. He told her he was not going to apologize to her again in this room, because she had said already that she would consider the matter over the brown teapot, and he did not wish to insult her by repeating himself. But he would apologize once more, in writing, that night, in a note that would be in her dressing room when she went up, and she might keep it, or burn it, as she chose. And in the morning his mother would discover the keys had moved, and at breakfast she would not be civil to her, and at noon she would write to Lady Pemberton, and by Tuesday the Pembertons would have invited themselves to dinner. And so on. He did not pretend it was going to be a quiet 10 weeks, but he wanted her to know that he had heard her, that he should do exactly the dry, unromantic thing she had asked him to do, and that... But he was very glad she had come today, and not tomorrow. She asked, with mild irony, whether he was, when he had just learned that his mother had sent her to the servants' hall. He answered that he was glad of it precisely for that reason. Had she come tomorrow, his mother would have sent her to the servants' hall in front of half the village, and he should have had to do all of this in front of Lady Pemberton. Charlotte considered that. She conceded the point and pronounced him welcome. He smiled, very briefly, and rose. He bid her eat her supper, sleep, and trust that they would begin in the morning. He bowed. He went out. Charlotte sat on the brocade sofa in the rose drawing-room of Westmere Hall, with her amber wool catching the firelight, and watched the door close behind him, and felt, for the first time in 3 months, the small, steady warmth of a thing that was no longer up to her alone. Then she ate Mrs. Tobin's apple pudding. It was very good. The keys moved at 6 in the morning. By the time the Countess of Maine came down to breakfast at 9:30, late, deliberately, for the purpose of being awaited, her son had been at his desk in the muniment room for 3 hours. The household had been informed, in writing, on a single sheet, signed and sealed and read aloud by Mrs. Penrose at the servants' breakfast at 5, and Charlotte Avery was sitting at the small round table in the breakfast parlour, her hair freshly coiled, in a moss-green morning gown, eating buttered eggs and reading the Times. The Countess came in. She stopped on the threshold. She had not expected to see Miss Avery in the breakfast parlour at all. She had expected, in fact, to be told Miss Avery had taken her breakfast on a tray. The blow registered, very briefly, in the upward flicker of her chin, and then her face settled into the composed grey ice of a woman who never permits herself to be visibly surprised. "Good morning, my lady," said Charlotte, rising and curtsying with perfect correctness. "I hope I have not taken your usual chair." "My usual chair is the one to the right of the window," said the Countess, "but you may keep yours. We shall be informal." She crossed to the sideboard. She took, with great deliberation, only a small slice of dry toast and a cup of black tea, in order to convey by example that she required no more than that of the world. She sat. She unfolded her napkin. She did not look at Charlotte. She said, in a voice that had been rehearsed, a little, in the long, dim minutes between the dressing-room and the breakfast parlour, "Miss Avery, I owe you an apology." Charlotte set down the Times. "Your Grace," the Countess corrected herself, fractionally, with the precision of a woman who had decided in advance which titles she would permit herself to use and which she would not. "Forgive me, my dear. I had not been informed of your engagement to my son. He chose, for reasons no doubt good to himself, not to write to me on the matter while you were in mourning. When you arrived yesterday in your travelling dress in the marble hall, I confess I assumed you were the new milliner from Tunbridge come on the wrong day. The fault is mine. Adrian has explained the matter to me this morning." "Has he?" said Charlotte. "He has explained that you are the daughter of Sir Edmund Avery, Knighted, I believe, for his services during the cholera in 19, and that you and he have been corresponding for a year. He has also informed me that the keys of the household are now, on a temporary basis, with Mrs. Penrose, until such time as you may take them up after the wedding. So, you see, we are quite informed of one another now. I felicitate you." Charlotte buttered another slice of toast, slowly, and did not answer. The Countess permitted a small silence to stretch. Then, with the same controlled mildness, she added, "I feel I should say, however, that no engagement is entirely unbreakable, even one entered into in the warmth of mutual grief. If, at any time, my dear, you find that the position of Duchess of Westmere is heavier than you had anticipated, you will find me a sympathetic friend. Some young women, having lost a beloved father, mistake the protection of a strong man for a settled affection, and the discovery comes too late." The pause she left, after this, was quite generous. "My lady," Charlotte said finally, "I shall remember your sympathy, and I should very much like to ask you a question, if I may." "By all means." "Is the small Indian shawl you wore yesterday the malachite green one with the pomegranate border, or have I misidentified the dye? I noticed it as I came in. I admired it very much." The Countess blinked. "It is, yes, the malachite with the pomegranate. Madras work, I think?" "Madras work, yes." "How beautifully chosen. My father had an interest in the Indian dyes. He kept a small notebook on them. I should like, if you would permit it, to copy the pattern of the border for my own. I shall not, of course, ever wear the colour in your presence, since it is plainly your signature, but I should like to make a sketch." "Of course," said the Countess very slowly. "By all means." "You are most kind." Charlotte returned to her toast. The Countess waited for Charlotte to do something else, to press an advantage, to allude to the keys, to accept her dropped hint about broken engagements, to flush, to flounder. Charlotte did none of these things. She buttered her toast. She turned a page of the Times. She inquired, without lifting her eyes, whether the Countess preferred her tea with milk or without, and when the Countess replied without, Charlotte said, "Quite right. This leaf does not take milk well," and went on reading. The Countess of Maine had spent 30 years of married life and 10 years of widowed authority, becoming the woman in any room whose silences were noticed first. To find herself sitting opposite a young woman whose silences were merely those of a person engaged in toast and a newspaper, and who had asked her, in the middle of a perfectly clear opening for capitulation, about the dye of her shawl, was a thing she had not yet experienced. She finished her toast. She folded her napkin. She rose. "I shall be at my embroidery in the morning room," she said, "if you should wish to call upon me." "Thank you, my lady. I shall sketch the shawl border later in the day, when the light has come round." "As you please." The Countess left. The breakfast parlour was quiet. Mrs. Penrose, who had been standing in the doorway for the last 3 minutes pretending to inspect the silver, turned a startled sherry red and withdrew. Charlotte continued her newspaper. Half a minute passed. Adrian came in. He had been listening, of course, from the panelled corridor that ran behind the sideboard wall. There was a small grille beside the chimney that any boy raised in this house would have known about, and the Duke of Westmere had been raised in this house. He came in, still in his shirt sleeves, his coat over his arm, his dark hair pushed back from his forehead with one hand, and he stood looking at Charlotte at the breakfast table, with the expression of a man who has just witnessed something he had not previously believed possible. She had asked her about her shawl, he said. She had admired her shawl, Charlotte returned. He repeated the words back to her. She had admired her shawl. "It was a very fine shawl, Your Grace," she said with mild patience, and she did not see why malice in another room should oblige her to be unobservant about textiles. He sat down opposite her. He looked at her for a long moment. He did not say anything. Then he reached across the cloth, very deliberately, and took her hand, the same hand he had kissed in the kitchen the night before. the hand with the ink stain at the inside knuckle of the second finger, and held it, palm down on the linen, his thumb tracing once across the back of her knuckles, and said, "Charlotte, I am not afraid of my mother in the slightest any more, not since 6 o'clock this morning. But I shall confess to you that I was afraid she might be the one thing capable of frightening you, and I see now that she is not. Will you marry me by special license in 3 weeks?" Charlotte put down the Times. 2 months, she reminded him. They had agreed 2 months. 3 weeks, he answered. 3 weeks, she pointed out, would put them inside the period of decent waiting after her father's mourning by exactly 6 days. And the neighborhood would count those 6 days. The neighborhood would count 3 weeks too, he returned. He would rather be married within 3 weeks and accept the talk than within 9 weeks and not have her in his house through Christmas. She looked at him. She did not pull her hand away. She offered 6 weeks, and a wedding so quiet there should be nothing for the neighborhood to count. The vicar, the family, Mrs. Penrose, Mrs. Tobin, Wellington, if he could persuade him. 6 weeks, he agreed, and Wellington. Then they were settled, she pronounced, and he agreed they were settled. He raised her hand, the one he had been holding palm down, and turned it, and pressed his lips into the soft place at the inside of her wrist, where the pulse moved under thin skin, and the kiss was longer than the kiss in the kitchen had been, and warmer, and harder to pretend was a formality. Mrs. Penrose came back into the room with a fresh pot of coffee, took one look, and went out again. 6 weeks, then. The first week passed in writing. Charlotte wrote to Dr. Mowbray in London, who had been her father's physician and friend, and asked him 3 apparently unrelated questions. Had he ever heard of a country surgeon by the name of Burridge, said to be in practice near Westmere? Had he ever, in the course of his work for the naval charity, encountered a Mr. Hadbury, solicitor? And had he kept any of Sir Edmund's last letters concerning the fund the Duke of Westmere had commissioned for the relief of the labourers of the Westmere estates after the bad harvest of '24? Dr. Mowbray, who was a good man and an excellent friend, wrote back at the next post. She wrote also to the Mrs. Avery, her father's 2 unmarried sisters in Tunbridge Wells, whom she had loved since girlhood, and who had spent the last 3 months sending her tightly packed letters of practical advice and small dried lavender bags. She told them, in her clearest hand, that the engagement was still on, that the Duke was a good man, that the mother of the Duke was as advertised, and that they should expect a wedding invitation in 5 weeks, and on no account were they to bring their parrot. She wrote, on the 3rd evening, a single careful letter to Mrs. Pemberton, accepting, on behalf of herself and the Duke, an invitation she had not yet received. Mrs. Pemberton, who was the Countess of Maine's closest ally, and whose carriage had been seen on the Westmere Drive every Wednesday afternoon for 15 years, would find herself flattered into issuing the invitation she had not in fact intended to issue, and would do so with the puzzled air of a woman who could not afterwards remember whose idea any of it had been. She wrote, after each of these letters, in a small private notebook that lived in the drawer of her writing desk, a list of everything she had observed about the household of Westmere Hall. She wrote on the first page, "Mr. Gable, head steward, will not look at strangers when he speaks to them. Looks at the 3rd button of their coat. Hands always clean. Country shoes always clean. A man whose work is not in the fields." She wrote on the second page, "The Countess receives no letters at the Morning Post. 2 letters are taken to her between 11 and noon by her own maid, Burrows, who carries them up from the bag in the map room. The bag goes first to the Countess's apartment, then to the Duke's. The order is wrong. The order has been wrong, Mrs. Penrose says, for some years." She wrote on the 3rd page, "The estate accounts, Mr. Gable says, are kept at the Tunbridge office by Mr. Hadbury's clerk. I have asked the Duke if a duplicate is held in the muniment room. The Duke, who I think is honest, says he believes there is one, but has not looked at it inside the last 2 years. He has been busy with Parliament." She wrote on the 4th page, "Wellington the parrot says 4 phrases, of which 2 are decent. The decent 2 are, 'Position yourselves,' and 'Tea, please.' The other two I shall not write down. Mrs. Tobin says he learned them from a sea captain at the docks at Plymouth, and the Royal Navy is to blame for everything. She wrote, on the 5th page, Adrian came and stood in the door of my sitting room last night and asked, without coming in, whether I had everything I needed. I said I had. He said, then I shall go to bed. And then he stood there for the time it takes a candle to flicker once and said, good night, Charlotte, and went away. I am putting this here because I do not yet know which page it belongs in. It does not belong with Mr. Gable. She underlined that last sentence twice, lightly, and shut the book. The second week brought the Pembertons. Lord Pemberton, heavy, courteous, 60, a man with no convictions and excellent claret, and his wife, slim, narrow-eyed, 10 years younger than her husband, her hair set into the perfect cap of an age she had never quite reached, arrived for dinner on the Tuesday, and found the Duke of Westmere already in the drawing-room, his betrothed beside him on the long sofa, and his mother standing at the window, with the small, fixed smile of a hostess no longer in possession of her own keys. Lady Pemberton dropped the briefest possible curtsy and pronounced herself charmed. Charlotte answered with a quiet civility that they were very kind, and asked whether they would not sit. Lord Pemberton, who had not quite decided yet which way the wind blew, observed that Westmere had been in town. Adrian agreed there had been much to do at Westminster. Lord Pemberton hazarded a guess at the cholera bill. Adrian corrected him. The bill on parish dispensaries. There was no cholera, thank God, this season. The bill provided for there being a parish surgeon within 2 miles of every market town. He was persuaded by it. He had had reason to be persuaded by it last year, when his own labourers' children had been 5 hours from the nearest physician. How modern, said Lady Pemberton, with a faint distaste, as if modernity were a smell. Charlotte mentioned, mildly, that her father had written a pamphlet on the matter 12 years ago. She said his Grace and she had read the same pamphlet. He had written a pamphlet on parish dispensaries, Lady Pemberton repeated faintly. He had written 3, Charlotte returned. The 3rd had been published only the year before his death. Forgive her, before his last illness. It had been the matter that occupied him most. They had brought a copy this evening, in case his Grace had not yet seen it. How thoughtful, said Lady Pemberton, in a voice that was quite the opposite of thoughtful. The Countess, at the window, said nothing. Dinner was served. Clear soup, a turbot, a saddle of mutton, a charlotte russe. Mrs. Tobin had a sense of humour the kitchen was beginning to discover. A savoury, a dessert. Charlotte sat at the right of the Duke. The Countess had been placed at the foot of the table. She had refused, very quietly, the seat at the head opposite her son, although it had been hers for 10 years, on the small ground that the family is in the hands of the new mistress, and the mistress should not yet be there. It was a beautiful, ungainsayable manoeuvre. It compelled Charlotte to leave the head chair empty, and it had taken the Countess until the soup to deploy it. Charlotte looked at the empty chair at the head of the table. She looked at Adrian. She looked back at the empty chair. Mrs. Penrose, she said in her clearest voice, would you be so kind as to remove the head chair from the table tonight? Until the Duke and I are married, neither of us shall sit in it. We shall not have an empty seat in our company. It is unkind to the room. Pray have the carvers passed at his Grace's place, and the dishes circulated as ordinary. Mrs. Penrose, who had been drilled in the etiquette of the head chair for 4 decades, and who had been waiting all dinner for somebody to do something about it, removed the head chair so quickly that 2 footmen nearly collided. The Countess of Maine permitted her chin to rise, very slightly, and then to lower again, and ate her soup. Capital idea, said Lord Pemberton into the silence. Capital. Miss Avery, said Lady Pemberton, who could not quite leave it alone. I had not realized your father was still practicing in his last years. He was, my lady. In Sevenoaks. In Sevenoaks. Although in his final winter most of his patients came up to London with him, since he had been asked by the Naval Charity to assist with a difficult survey on hospital fever. He worked from a small consulting room in Mr. Mowbray's house in Cheapside. I went up to assist him on Tuesdays and Thursdays. You assisted him, said Lady Pemberton. How unusual. Not in the sense you mean, my lady. I drew up his ledgers. I had a clerk's hand, and his eyes were tired. A clerk's hand? Yes, my lady. I make a respectable book. I can balance to the penny. Good heavens. My father said it was the only useful skill of which my mother despaired, and from which my husband would profit. Adrian, beside her, had stopped eating his mutton with the neatness of a man trying not to laugh. The Countess, at the foot of the table, said nothing. How practical, said Lady Pemberton, who appeared at this point to have run out of two-syllable adjectives. The world is very full of practical women, my lady. Often the men beside them have not noticed, and are the better for it. Lord Pemberton chose this moment to choke on his claret. He recovered. He set down his glass. He looked at Charlotte for the first time since he had sat down, with the careful, narrowed regard of a man who had just discovered the wind blew a different direction than he had assumed. Capital, said Lord Pemberton again, more softly. Capital. The Countess of Maine, that night, rang for her maid Burrows at 10:30, an hour earlier than was her custom, and dictated 3 letters before the candles were brought. She did not seal them herself. Burrows took them. Burrows, going down the back stairs with the 3 letters in the pocket of her apron, met Mrs. Penrose on the half-landing. The 2 women looked at each other in a way they had not looked at each other in 20 years. Burrows, said Mrs. Penrose quietly. Mrs. Penrose, said Burrows. Then Burrows went on down the stairs, and Mrs. Penrose went up. Neither of them spoke again that evening. But on the back of an envelope from her own writing desk, before she went to bed, Mrs. Penrose wrote 3 names, for she had glimpsed them in the candlelight on the half-landing, very briefly, on the directions of the letters in Burrows's apron, and slid the envelope under the door of the Rose drawing-room, where Charlotte was still up, reading, with a single candle. Charlotte, who had not yet decided whether to like Mrs. Penrose or merely respect her, took the envelope, opened it, copied the 3 names into a notebook, burned the envelope in the candle flame, and went to bed. The names were Lady Pemberton, Mr. Hadbury, solicitor, Tunbridge, and a Mrs. Beale of Margate, address unknown. Dr. Mowbray's reply came at the end of the 2nd week. Charlotte read it 3 times in the Rose drawing-room, by morning light, while a slow autumn drizzle moved across the lawns, and the gardener's boy pulled the last of the dahlias. Then she put it into her writing case, walked through the long gallery to the muniment room at the back of the east wing, and knocked on the door. Come. She came in. Adrian was at the great oak table, with a row of folio account books in front of him, his coat off, his shirt sleeves turned back to show forearms tanned in summer and pale now at the wrist, a pen behind his ear. The room smelled of old leather and ink, and the faint coal smoke of a fire that had been lit since dawn. Through the window, the dahlias the boy had not yet pulled were a violent, unbothered red against the wet stone. She had brought him a letter from Dr. Mowbray, she said, and she should like to look at the estate account books with him for an hour. Both at once, he repeated. Both at once, she answered. He set down his pen. He looked at her face. He stood up. He bid her sit, take whichever chair was warmer, and he would send for coffee. He asked her to tell him what Dr. Mowbray said. She sat. She read aloud from the letter, with her notebook open on her knee, and translated as she went. Dr. Mowbray, she explained, had not heard of any Mr. Burridge in country practice within 50 miles of Tunbridge. No such surgeon was registered with the Royal College, and none was known to the Naval Charities parish lists. He had, however, heard a great deal of Mr. Hadbury, solicitor of Tunbridge, who had handled the bankruptcy of a Mrs. Beale of Margate in 1820, with what Dr. Mowbray had termed, in characteristic dryness, such celerity that the creditors received 9p in the pound, and the property reappeared, by a series of assignments, in the name of a third party not at all displeased with the result. Charlotte set the letter down on her knee and watched Adrian's face. That Mrs. Beale, she went on, was, Dr. Mowbray believed, a woman who had once been a lady's maid in a house of consequence, and who had, on her ostensible bankruptcy, retired to a property at Margate, purchased entirely in cash. The third party, in whose name the property eventually rested, Dr. Mowbray, had been unable to identify. He proposed to call upon a clerk he knew in Doctors' Commons the following week, and to give her an answer at the next post. She turned the page. "Now the matter of the fund itself," she said. The fund Sir Edmund had drawn up for the relief of the labourers on the Westmere estates after the bad harvest of '24. She had asked Dr. Mowbray whether he had seen anything of the disbursements. He had. Her father had kept duplicate receipts of all the relief grants, since he had been the medical referee for the fund. He had every receipt for every quarter from Michaelmas 24 to Lady Day 26. He had sent her copies. She drew the copies from the writing case. There were 37 of them. She laid them in 3 piles on the oak table. Adrian came round and stood behind her chair. The grants, she explained, ran from £2 to £12 apiece, paid to named labourers, the receipts signed in their own hands or by the parish overseer, where the labourer could not write. She had done the addition twice. The sums totalled £647, 3 shillings and 4 pence. Her father's records were exact. He had carried a horror of the loose pound. The estate ledger in front of him, Adrian replied quietly, showed disbursements to the relief fund of £912, 2 shillings and 6 pence. Charlotte answered without looking up. The arithmetic was as plain as it sounded. £264, 19 shillings and 2 pence, drawn from his estate accounts in the name of relief grants over those 18 months, had not reached her father's hands at the naval charity offices, and had therefore not reached his labourers. He did not speak for a long time. When he did, he said only the steward's name. Mr. Gable, Charlotte agreed, would have written the cheques. She did not say he had kept the money. She said it was unlikely he had kept it alone. Hadbury would have processed the cheques. The third party at Margate held the property in the name of a Mrs. Beale, a woman once a lady's maid in a house of consequence. And there she stopped. She would not name the house of consequence to him, she said, until Dr. Mowbray had named it to her. She should not like to be wrong on insufficient evidence. There was a difference between knowing and proving, and that morning she intended to honour it. He set his hands on the back of her chair, very lightly, and she felt them through the wool of her gown, and for a moment neither of them said anything. The fire in the grate moved. The dahlias outside moved. After a long breath, he said her name. She answered with hers. What she had told him, he set out aloud, as plainly as a man writing to himself. That for at least 18 months, by the most modest count, his mother, or at the very least someone close enough to her to act on her authority, had been drawing from this estate £250 a year, intended for his labourers, and lodging it at Margate. She corrected him gently. She had told him the figures only. She had not yet told him who stood at the centre of them. She should like another 2 weeks, 3 letters from Dr. Mowbray, and a single conversation with Mr. Gable in this room. After those things, she would tell him who was at the centre. And she would tell him with proof in writing, of the kind no court would dispute, and no friend of the family would be able to contradict at a dinner table. Until then, they would do nothing. They would be civil to his mother, civil to the Pembertons, civil to Mr. Gable. They would not move. He observed, with a faint, dry edge that was almost humour, that she asked a great deal of his civility. She returned that she asked a great deal of his discipline, and that he had a great deal of it. He laughed. It was a low, quiet laugh, not the startled, cracked laugh of the kitchen, but a settled one. He bent his head and pressed his lips briefly to the top of her hair, where it was coiled at the nape, and straightened, and went back to his side of the table. He asked what she wished him to do for the next 2 weeks. She gave him the list as he sat down. Be in Parliament for the days he must be in Parliament, be at home for the rest, take her riding on Saturday since it had been promised and Lady Pemberton would hear of it, sit with her at Sunday morning service, drink his mother's health at dinner without flinching, and bring her, if he could, the original commission of the Relief Fund, in the form in which it had first been agreed between her father and himself. From those things, she said, she would take it forward. He asked if there were anything else. She looked up at him. "Trust me," she said. He set his hand flat on the oak table, between them, and answered that she had not yet asked him for the one thing he had already given her, and that she might ask him for many other things besides. She put her hand over his, briefly, on the oak table. Then she withdrew it, and stood, and gathered the receipts, and went out, and the door clicked shut behind her. And Adrian sat for a long moment with his palm still flat on the wood, and the dahlias outside the window steady and very red against the wet stone. The third week brought the storm. It had been threatening for 4 days, a low, close ceiling of grey over the downs, the line of birds shifting south, the wind pulling the last of the leaves off the chestnuts in the avenue. Adrian had, on the Saturday morning, kept his promise and ordered out the bay mare and his own black gelding. He and Charlotte rode at a controlled walk down the back lane to the river meadow and over the stone bridge to the long ride at Westmere Wood. The bay mare was a sweet little mare with a habit of putting her ears back at sheep. Charlotte rode her well. The Duke had watched, on the first turn at the river, the way she sat, and had observed that she had hunted as a girl then. She returned that her father's brother had kept a small pack at Tunbridge. She had been promoted to hounds at 12 and disgraced at 15 for laughing at a master. He asked what the master had done. "He had fallen off his horse, Your Grace," she answered. She could not help it. He inquired, with grave amusement, whether she had told him to position himself. She had not yet met Wellington, she said. He had laughed. He had laughed all the way over the stone bridge. It was on the way home, an hour later than they should have been on the way home, that the wind dropped. Adrian, who had grown up on these downs, knew what a dropped wind in November meant. He turned in the saddle. The light over Westmere Wood had changed. The grey ceiling was now a dark green grey, and the birds had stopped. Very evenly, he said they had 10 minutes, possibly 7. She asked where they could get to in 7. Burrows's cottage, he answered, the bottom of the long ride, half a mile. Then he was to lead, she said. He led. They cantered the half-mile down the long ride, the bay mare flying with the same readiness with which she had walked, and the first heavy spit of rain caught them at the gate of Burrows's cottage, with 2 minutes to spare. By the time they had got the horses into Burrows's small stable, and Burrows's wife, a thin, small woman in a plain green wool, had brought them through her low front door into her kitchen, the storm had broken open over the downs in earnest. The rain came at the cottage windows in long, wet slaps. The fire in the hearth threw out its honest, comfortable heat. Burrows's wife made tea, refused payment for it, refused payment for the hay her husband was even at that moment giving the horses, and went up the wooden stair to fetch a clean piece of flannel for Charlotte's hair. Adrian gestured to the fire and told her to sit close to it. She was wet through. She returned that he was too. He answered that he was only wet at the shoulders. She was wet at the hem. She insisted she was quite warm. He observed that she was very stubborn. She replied she was wet at the hem and warm where it counted, and there was a difference. She had taken off her riding hat and her travelling cloak, and the moss-green wool of her riding habit was indeed wet to the knees. He took off his own riding coat and laid it across her shoulders without asking permission. She thanked him by withdrawing, formally, the word stubborn. He demanded the grounds. She gave him the counterexample on which she rested her case, and he conceded. He sat down on the small wooden settle beside her, the green wool of her habit dark with rain against the dark green of his coat across her shoulders, and Burrows's wife bustled back down the stairs with the flannel and made fresh tea. And Burrows himself came in, with his hat dripping, and the news that the storm would last 2 hours at the least, and that the bridge at the lower meadow would be impassable until morning. Adrian said they should be his guests until the storm broke, if he would have them. Burrows answered that it was an honour, Your Grace. Adrian returned that there was no honour, only shelter, and asked, before he forgot, whether his grandson was not rising 8. 8 in March, Your Grace, Burrows said. His agent had put the boy on the list for the new village school at Westmere, Adrian told him. The opening was at Candlemas, and Mrs. Penrose would have written to his wife. She had, Your Grace, Burroughs said. They were very obliged. It was owed, Adrian answered. Burroughs went out to his horses. Mrs. Burroughs returned to her kitchen. The Duke and Charlotte sat on the wooden settle in front of the cottage fire, his coat across her shoulders, the rain at the windows, and for some long minutes neither of them said anything. After a time she said his name, and he answered. It was the first time she had called him that, she observed. He knew, he said. She asked whether he was going to comment upon it. He was going to remember it, he answered. That, she said quietly, That was a very good answer. He looked at her sideways. The flannel had given her hair the soft, loose curl it took when wet, and the firelight had warmed her face out of the sharp grey it had carried all the wet ride home, and the moss green of her habit, against the rough, dark green of his coat, made her look like something painted in oils 100 years ago, and walked in out of the frame. He did not say any of this. He said instead the thing that was simpler. She sat a horse beautifully, he said. That was not what he had been thinking, she returned. It was not, he conceded. It was, however, true. What were you thinking? He hesitated. The rain at the windows picked up, dropped, picked up again. I was thinking, he said, that I have spent the last fortnight conducting myself in your presence as though we had 3 years of careful courtship behind us, instead of a single proposal rushed through at your father's bedside. I have been waiting, very patiently, until the wedding. I am no longer entirely certain why I am waiting. There are very respectable reasons why you are waiting. Name them. She turned her face to him. They were close enough on the settle that the small gold flecks in his dark brown eyes were quite visible, and she could see, where the flannel had brushed his temple, that the rain had pulled one dark, coppery curl down over the line of his brow. I cannot name them at this exact moment, she said. I shall name them again later. That is, he said, a very good answer. He bent his head. The tip of his nose, cold from the ride, brushed the curve of her cheek. He did not kiss her. He held the half-inch between them, as a man holds a bow drawn but not loosed. And he said, against her temple, I shall not, in Mrs. Burroughs' kitchen, do anything I shall regret in my own house. But I should like you to know, Charlotte, that I am inclined to regret it. That I am very inclined indeed. Noted, Your Grace. You are still calling me Your Grace. Only when teasing. Then by all means continue. She turned the half-inch. Her mouth touched the corner of his, only the corner, only for the time it takes a candle to flicker once, and then she drew back, and pressed her flannel-cooled cheek for a moment against his cold one, and they stayed like that until Mrs. Burroughs came back into the kitchen with a fresh teapot, and pretended, with magnificent country tact, that she had observed nothing whatsoever. The storm lasted 2.5 hours. By the time the bay mare and the black gelding clattered out of Burroughs's small stable and turned for home, the worst of the cloud had drawn off the downs, and a thin, late afternoon sun was lying long and sideways on the wet stone walls of the lane, and the Duke of Westmere was, for the first time in 2 years, riding home from his estate with the secure, private knowledge of a man who has not regretted the half-inch. Mrs. Penrose was waiting in the stable yard. Your Grace, she said. Miss Avery, there is a visitor at the house, Mr. Hadbury, the solicitor. He has been there since 1. Her ladyship sent for him from Tunbridge. Adrian dismounted. He helped Charlotte down. He did not let go of her hand at the bottom of the dismount. Has he been received? In her ladyship's morning room. They have been an hour and a half. Has Mr. Gable been called for? He arrived at 2:30. He is also there. Charlotte looked at Adrian. Adrian looked at Charlotte. I shall go up and change, she said. I shall come down in 20 minutes. We shall not interrupt them. Let the meeting end. Let Mr. Hadbury go. Let Mr. Gable return to the steward's office. We shall do nothing tonight. But, Mrs. Penrose, Yes, Miss Avery. After Mr. Hadbury has left, would you be so kind as to send Burrows, the Countess's maid, down to the housekeeper's room on a small errand? Let her be there for 10 minutes, and let her find that Mrs. Tobin has just had bad news from Plymouth and is in tears. While Burrows is occupied with comforting her, I shall be in the Countess's apartment for 3 minutes precisely. I require to look at one drawer of one writing desk. I shall not be there longer. Mrs. Penrose's eyes went very round. Miss Avery. It is for his Grace's sake, Mrs. Penrose, and for the sake of the labourers of this estate, and not for any private satisfaction of mine. If you are unwilling, I shall not ask you again. I am willing, said Mrs. Penrose, very softly. I have been waiting 6 years to be asked. She went away. Adrian looked at Charlotte. He did not say anything for a long moment. Then he said, 3 minutes. 3 minutes. I should like to come with you. You should not. You are the master of this house. The master of a house does not search his mother's writing desk. The mistress of the house, even in advance of marriage, may. It is one of the few advantages of being the dry, unromantic figure I have lately become. You are not a dry, unromantic figure. I shall pretend to be one for an hour. She took her hand back from his at last, and went up the back stair, and changed out of the wet riding habit into the moss green again, and found Mrs. Penrose in the corridor outside the Countess's apartment at the agreed hour. Burrows had, indeed, been called down. The Countess was in the Rose drawing-room with her embroidery. The Duke was in the muniment room. Mr. Hadbury had been sent on his way at 4:30, and Mr. Gable was back in the steward's office, reconciling the Michaelmas rents. Charlotte went into her ladyship's apartment. Mrs. Penrose stood at the door. The writing desk was an exquisite piece of marquetry, Sheraton, with sycamore inlay, that had stood under the south window for 30 years. The middle drawer was locked. Charlotte knew, from her father's old surgery, where the medicine cabinet had been Sheraton with sycamore inlay and locked daily, that this style of lock yielded to a hairpin in the right hand, and her hand was the right hand. The drawer slid open at the second turn. There were 3 letters in the drawer, tied with green ribbon. There was a small ledger book bound in red morocco. There was a folded paper of bank drafts. There was a small pasteboard miniature in a velvet case. Charlotte did not touch the letters or the bank drafts. She opened the ledger. She turned 6 pages very fast. She closed the ledger. She put it back exactly as she had found it. She opened the velvet case of the miniature and looked at the face. A young woman in a maid's cap, painted 30 years before by a competent country hand. Her name written on the back in faded ink. M. Beale, Margate, 1796. She closed the case. She put it back. She locked the drawer with the hairpin. She left the room. She went down the back stair to the still room. She passed Burrows on the landing. Burrows, red about the eyes, hurrying back up to her mistress. They did not look at each other. In the still room, Mrs. Penrose was waiting. Mrs. Beale of Margate, said Charlotte, was once Miss Burrows's mother. She was the Countess's maid before Burrows was. She left service at Westmere Hall in 1796, with a settlement of £300 on the grounds that she had been afflicted by a long illness contracted at sea. She purchased the property at Margate that same year. She has been, since then, the registered owner of an account at the Tunbridge Bank that receives, by quarterly draft, all the surplus monies of the Relief Fund. The account is signed for jointly by Mrs. Beale and Mr. Hadbury. I have seen the ledger. My God, said Mrs. Penrose. It is very old, Mrs. Penrose. The fraud has been, quietly, running for 30 years. The relief fund my father drew up 2 years ago was simply added to the channel that already existed. Mr. Gable has been writing the checks only since 2024. Before that, it was the previous steward, who has been 7 years gone from this earth. The architecture predates Mr. Gable by a great deal. And Burrows knows. Burrows is Mrs. Beale's daughter. Burrows has not had a will of her own in 30 years. Burrows is a sad and dangerous woman, and what she knows is whatever her ladyship instructs her to know. She is not the architect of any of this. And her ladyship is the architect of all of it. Has been since before the late Duke's time. The relief fund was a gift of opportunity. The original channel, the Margate property, the accounts at Tunbridge, has been her quiet income for 3 decades. She did not, I should say, regard it as criminal. She regarded it as her widow's portion, accumulated by foresight against the day her son might prove an inconveniently scrupulous master of the estate. Mrs. Penrose sat down on the still-room stool. She did not weep. She had been a housekeeper for 37 years, and her hand was steady on the wooden table. "Miss Avery, what shall you do?" "I shall do nothing tonight, Mrs. Penrose, and nothing for 1 further week, until Dr. Mowbray has confirmed the M. Beale of the miniature is the Mrs. Beale of the bankruptcy of 20. Then I shall do—" Mrs. Penrose, look at me. "Exactly the dry, unromantic thing the case requires. I shall present the evidence to His Grace in the muniment room, and His Grace and I shall present it to her ladyship in the muniment room, and her ladyship will be informed that she may either retire to a cottage in Bath of her son's choosing for the remainder of her life, with her allowance reduced to the bare provision of a baronet's widow, or she may answer at the quarter sessions for theft from her son's estate. She will choose Bath. She is not a woman who chooses the sessions." "Will it be public?" "Not unless she insists. Her son has no appetite for a public scandal in the year of his marriage, and I have no appetite for one ever. The discretion is not for her sake, Mrs. Penrose. It is for his." Mrs. Penrose nodded. She rose. She put her hand briefly on the deal table. She did not speak. After a moment, Charlotte put her own hand on top of Mrs. Penrose's, and the 2 women stood there in the still room, in the brown autumn smell of dried apples and lavender bunches and old linen, and did not look at each other. "Miss Avery," Mrs. Penrose said at last, "I have been with this house since I was 16. I have seen 4 mistresses in my time. The first was Adrian's grandmother, who was a saint. The second was the woman now upstairs, who was not. The third was Adrian's elder sister Augusta, who married out at 20 and was lost, forgive me, to childbed fever at 22. The fourth I am looking at. Mrs. Penrose. I am 61 years old, Miss Avery. I have not said an immoderate word in 3 decades. I shall not say one tonight either. But I will say to you, and I shall say it once, and you may hold me to it for the rest of your life, that I shall keep the keys for you while we wait. And after the wedding, I shall hand them to you in front of the whole household, with my hand on the Great Bible, and the parrot present, if His Grace insists, and the kitchen present, and the steward absent. And from that day on, I shall be your housekeeper, Miss Avery, and I shall not be the woman upstairs housekeeper 1 day longer. Mrs. Penrose. That is all, Miss Avery. She curtsied. She left the still room. Charlotte stood alone for a minute by the deal table, in the brown lavender smell, and let one slow breath out, and then went up to dress for dinner. The 4th week began the public test. The Westmere Harvest Gathering was, by long tradition, held on the 1st Saturday of November in the great barn on the home farm. Every tenant family on the estate came. The barn was hung with the year's pruned hop bines and the small round russet apples of the kitchen orchard, and trestle tables ran the length of the floor under candles in tin holders. The Duke and his guests sat at the far end on a low platform, the tenants at the long tables. The children ran in and out of the dance set up at the open end. 3 fiddles played. There was beer, and small ale, and cider, and Mrs. Tobin's gingerbread. It was, Charlotte understood, the public test. The Countess of Maine would be there. The Pembertons would be there. Mr. Gable would be there. Every farm wife on the estate would be there, with her opinion already formed. They would look at Charlotte. They would decide. She wore the ruby silk. She had not worn it for 3 months. It had been packed in the bottom of her trunk from her last winter in London, when she had worn it twice, once at a small concert at the Mansion House, once at a private dinner in Cheapside. And her father had said, the second time, that if she was going to take after her mother in colour, she might as well do it properly. The ruby was a deep oxblood ruby, the colour of rose hips after a frost. The neckline was lower than her morning gowns, and the long sleeves were of the same silk turned up to the elbow with a pleating of cream lace. She wore her mother's pearls at her throat, small but very fine, and the simple gold ring on her right hand that her father had given her on her 21st birthday. Mrs. Tobin, in the dressing room, dressing her hair into a high coil with a single deep red ribbon worked through it, said, "Miss Avery, you will fell the entire barn before the third dance." And Charlotte said, "Mrs. Tobin, that is the intention." Adrian met her at the foot of the great staircase. He did not say anything at all. He simply looked at her for the time it takes a clock to strike a single note, and then he offered his arm without a word, and they walked out of the marble entry, past the inlaid table, past the long line of footmen, into the carriage waiting on the gravel. "And the carriage," he said. "Tell me one thing about the ruby silk before we arrive." "It was made for my London season. It cost more than my father wished, and I wore it twice, and he forgave me both times. I have not worn it since I came home for his last winter. I expected, 3 months ago, never to wear it again. I am wearing it tonight, on the principle that my mother and my father would both have wished me to fell the entire barn before the third dance." He laughed, quietly, the settled laugh of the muniment room, and said, "Then that is what we shall do." The barn, when they entered it on the Duke's arm, did not at first realize what it was looking at. There was a quarter second of small noise, then half a second of silence, a real silence, all the way down to the third trestle table, and then a low, slow murmur that began at the back and rolled to the front like cloth pulled across a floor. Mrs. Burrows from the Storm Cottage was at the second table with her husband and her grandson. Her face went, in 3 seconds, from delighted to triumphant. She had told her sister in Sevenoaks that very morning that the new Miss Avery would do, and there it was. The new Miss Avery was doing, and was wearing ruby silk. And Mrs. Burrows, a countrywoman of 40 years standing, knew quality when she saw it on a country bride. "My God, Westmere," said Lord Pemberton from the platform. "Your bride is a thunderclap." "I had some idea of it, Pemberton." "Some idea of it. Some idea." Lord Pemberton accepted a tankard of cider from a footman and drank it down. "Well, I had £40 with old Cardew at the club that the engagement should be off by Christmas. I shall go up to town on Monday and pay him in full, and double, and tell him to take his cellar's worth out in good claret." Pemberton: "I'm not too proud to lose £40 in good company, Westmere. Miss Avery." "Madam." He stood. He bowed. It was, the barn understood, the moment Lord Pemberton crossed the floor. "Madam, I should like to ask you for the second dance, if your Duke can spare you." "I shall keep him in conversation in the meantime, my lord," Adrian said evenly. "My lord," Charlotte said, "with pleasure." The Countess of Maine, on a chair at the back of the platform, observed the crossing of Lord Pemberton without comment. Lady Pemberton, beside her, rearranged her shawl twice and did not speak. The first dance was the Duke's. He took Charlotte down the long line of the floor with the easy, confident step of a man who had been schooled in country dancing at 12 and had not forgotten the steps in 20 years. The barn watched. The barn approved. The barn made the small, steady applauding noise of country approval that is more flattering than any London ovation. The second dance was Lord Pemberton's, who handled Charlotte through the figures like a portly, avuncular bishop, and complimented her on her seat, and her wit, and her wine-glass, with the warmth of a man entirely converted to a new political party. The third dance Charlotte did not get to. The Countess of Maine, who had watched the second dance from the platform with the small, dry mouth of a strategist whose first plan had failed, rose, very deliberately, and walked the length of the platform to the edge, and waited for the second dance to end. When Lord Pemberton had returned Charlotte to Adrian's arm, she stepped down from the platform into the cleared centre of the floor, her dove-grey silk darker than the barn's lamplight, her pearls absolutely steady at her throat, and addressed the gathering in the clear, public voice of a countess at a country event. "Dear neighbours," she said, "dear good people of Westmere, forgive an old woman for stopping the music for a moment." The fiddles, on a glance from the Duke, stopped. "My son," she said, "has tonight introduced you to his betrothed, Miss Avery, the daughter of the late Sir Edmund Avery of Sevenoaks. We are all of us delighted in her. She is, as you have seen, a young woman of remarkable bearing, and I am confident the estate is most fortunate in her. But there is one small matter I should like to have aired in the presence of all of you, for I think it is the kind of thing that ought to be aired in country company, rather than left to whisper in town." A murmur rose. Adrian's arm under Charlotte's hand went very still. "Do not," Charlotte murmured without moving. "I shall not," he said, equally without moving. "Miss Avery," continued the Countess smoothly, "is the daughter of a most respected medical man. We are all of us aware, however, that Sir Edmund's last years were not entirely free from financial difficulty. I make no judgment of the difficulty itself. Many fine families have known similar reverses. I mention it only because I think it right, before the wedding goes forward, that everybody here understand that Miss Avery's coming to Westmere is, as it must be, a great relief to her, and that all of us in this house intend to make her more than welcome on those terms." The barn went perfectly still. Charlotte felt Adrian's arm tighten under her hand. She squeezed it once, very lightly, in warning, and stepped deliberately away from him. She walked into the cleared center of the floor. She faced the Countess. The pearls at her throat caught the candlelight. The ruby silk took the candlelight and threw it back at the rafters. "My lady," she said, in her clearest voice, the voice of the breakfast parlour, "may I trouble you for one short clarification, in front of the same good company you have so kindly addressed?" "By all means, my dear." "You said my father's last years were not entirely free from financial difficulty. Will you tell us all here in what particular year and on what particular ground the difficulty arose? Was it the year the bill for parish dispensaries failed, in which my father lost the publication subscription he had counted on? Was it the year of the naval charity audit, in which my father refused fees for 40 hospital fever cases on the grounds that the fund had been raised for the men and not for himself? Or was it the year in which my father drew up, without payment, the original commission for the relief fund of the Westmere estate? The relief fund my father insisted should be paid in full to the labourers of this estate, and in respect of which sums, my lady, I understand certain moneys have not entirely arrived at their destination." The barn did not move. The Countess's chin came up. Her face, which had been grey with the small grey of the dove-grey silk, went, in 2 seconds, 2 shades whiter. "I do not understand you, Miss Avery." "Do you not, my lady?" "You are speaking out of turn. This is hardly the place—" "It was you, my lady, who selected the place. I shall complete what you began, since the people you have just addressed deserve to hear the whole of it. The relief fund of the Westmere estate, my lady, was drawn up by my father at his Grace's request after the bad harvest of '24, for the relief of the labouring families of these very farms. The fund was administered through the naval charity offices in London, and my father, as is the custom of country physicians in such matters, retained all the duplicate receipts. I have those receipts now in my possession at the Hall." She paused. Her grey eyes did not leave the Countess's face. "They show grants paid to the labouring families of this estate in the sum of £647. The disbursements drawn against the estate accounts in the same name and for the same period, however, total £912. The difference, my lady, has been lodged at quarterly intervals at the Tunbridge Bank in the name of one Mrs. M. Beale of Margate, who was, my lady, your own personal maid in this house in the year before your marriage, and whose daughter is your present maid, Burrows." A noise went through the barn. It was the noise of 130 country tenants, finally hearing the answer to a question they had been asking each other in private for 30 years. This, said the Countess very quietly, is monstrous. It is, my lady. I should not have raised it tonight had you not chosen to challenge my late father's character before his daughter and his future husband, and the people whose children are even at this moment alive on his charity. I have raised it now. I shall not raise it again in public. After tonight, His Grace and I shall handle the matter privately, with such discretion as remains possible to us, and the labourers whose grants did not arrive shall receive them in full from your widow's portion in the next 2 quarters. Will you sit down, my lady? The fiddles will play. The third dance shall begin. And I shall thank you, in everybody's hearing, for the kindness with which you have welcomed me into the house I shall in 8 days be the mistress of. The Countess did not move. Charlotte curtsied to her. It was a perfect, deep, formal curtsy, the sort of curtsy reserved in country company for the Princess Royal at a state opening. She held it for 2 beats. Then she rose and turned and walked back to Adrian, and the barn, the entire barn, 200 souls, burst into the small, steady, applauding noise of country approval that is more flattering than any London ovation, and the fiddles, on a single signal from the platform, struck up the third dance. Adrian took her into his arms for it. You said dry, he murmured into her hair, and unromantic. That was last week. You are wearing ruby silk, Charlotte, and you have just executed my mother in front of the home farm with a curtsy. There was a great deal of provocation, Your Grace. There was. Charlotte. Yes? I'm going to kiss you in 8 days at the parish church, and not before. But I should like you to know that I am very glad you came in November, and not in March. Are you, Your Grace? I am. The third dance went round, and round, and round. The Countess of Maine left the barn before the 4th dance. Mr. Gable, who had been at the corner of the long table, left at the same time but by a different door. Lady Pemberton, after a pause of nearly a minute, also left, and Lord Pemberton stayed and danced 2 more sets, and accepted a pint of small ale, and thanked Adrian with great warmth. By midnight, the fiddles had stopped, and the tenants were going home along the lanes by lantern, and the Duke and his betrothed walked back across the home farm field to Westmere Hall in the moonlight, and at the small white gate before the south lawn he stopped, and turned her toward him and said, very low, 8 days, Charlotte. 8 days, she agreed. Could it be 6? It could be 8. You are unkind. I am exact, Adrian. There is a difference. He laughed. He kissed the back of her hand once, formally, and they went up the south lawn in the moonlight to the lit windows of the house, and the long grass under the moon was already silvered with the first frost of the year. Mr. Hadbury returned the next morning at his own initiative. He had not been sent for. He came in his own gig, in his own black coat, with the particular sleepless face of a man who has been receiving the wrong sort of letters all night. He asked to see His Grace. His Grace received him in the muniment room, with Charlotte present, at the small chair in the corner with her notebook open on her knee, as if she were a clerk in attendance. And the conversation that followed lasted 40 minutes. It produced a signed deposition. Mr. Hadbury named 2 further accounts at the Tunbridge Bank. He named a smaller sum at Margate. He named the precise dates on which Mrs. Beale's drafts had been countersigned by the Countess of Maine. He named Mr. Gable's role, the writing of the cheques only, the unwitting hand on the lever, and signed his name beneath the deposition with a steady hand that surprised them both. He said, when he had finished, Your Grace, I shall receive whatever is owed me by the law, and I shall not raise my voice against it. I have one request only. Make it. I beg you, when this is settled, not to bring my daughter into the matter. She is 16 and at school in Margate, and she does not know anything of this. I shall sell my own house for the restitution. I shall not have my daughter shamed. Adrian was silent. Charlotte, in her corner, said nothing. After a moment, Adrian said, "Mr. Hadbury, the fund will be made whole from my mother's allowance over the next 2 quarters. The Tunbridge accounts will be closed. Mr. Gable will be dismissed without character, but without prosecution. You yourself will be debarred from practice in this county, and will surrender your articles. The matter will not go to the sessions. Your daughter's name will not be in any document this office produces. You have my word. Your Grace. Go home, Mr. Hadbury. Sell your house. Send your daughter to her aunt in Devon if you can. Do not appear in this house again." Mr. Hadbury rose. He bowed. He did not look at Charlotte once. He went out. The interview with the Countess took place at 3 o'clock that afternoon, in the same muniment room. She came in herself this time, without being summoned. She was not wearing her dove grey. She was wearing the slate blue that was her second favourite, with the malachite green Indian shawl at her shoulders, and the small pearl earrings she had worn at her wedding to the late Duke. Her hair was perfect. Her hands were perfect. Her chin was perfect. She did not sit until her son rose to offer her the chair, and then she sat, as if it were a chair on a stage, and the play had not quite begun. Charlotte was not in the room. She had asked to be in the room, and Adrian had said, "No, this one I shall do alone. You have done the rest. This part is mine." So it was alone. The Duke at the great oak table, the Countess in the offered chair, the dahlias outside the window, now quite stripped to their stems, that the conversation occurred. There was a cup of tea brought in by Mrs. Penrose. The Countess did not drink it. The Duke laid out, very quietly, in a flat, unornamented voice, the documents Charlotte had assembled. The duplicate receipts from Dr. Mowbray, the deposition signed at noon by Mr. Hadbury, the entry from the small red Morocco ledger that Charlotte had read in the locked drawer. Charlotte had, in fact, not removed it, and had simply written down by hand the relevant 6 pages, and the handwriting was incontestably the Countess's. He named the figures. He named the dates. He named Mrs. Beale by both her names. The Countess did not interrupt. She held her hands quite still in her lap. When he had finished, she said, very evenly, "What do you propose, Adrian?" "You shall retire to the small house at Bath that belonged to your Aunt Cecilia," he said. "Mrs. Penrose will pack what you require. Burrows you may take with you, on the strict condition that her involvement in the matter is never raised by either of you, in writing or in conversation. Your allowance will be reduced to 400 a year, sufficient for 2 servants and a modest establishment. You shall not return to Westmere Hall during my lifetime. If you require to see me, you may write to me, and I shall come to you at Bath once a year. You shall not write to Charlotte. The fund will be made whole from the 400 a year over the next 2 quarters. The matter shall not appear in any public document." "And if I refuse?" "You shall not refuse, Mamma." "And if I do?" "Then the documents go to my solicitor at Lincoln's Inn, and my solicitor at Lincoln's Inn will know what to do with them. He will do it on his own initiative. I shall not give the order. I do not intend to give it. But I shall not require to." A silence settled. It was the silence of a woman who, for the first time in 30 years, had heard a man in her family speak to her in a register she had thought lost in 1796. "Adrian?" "Yes, Mamma." "I shall accept Bath." "Thank you." "I should like to leave the day after the wedding." "You may leave the morning of the wedding. I shall not require you at the church. Mrs. Penrose has already begun the packing." "Adrian." "That is the whole of the matter, Mamma. I do not intend to discuss it again. I shall come and see you at Bath in the spring." She rose. She walked, very carefully, to the door. At the door she stopped. She did not turn around. "She is formidable, your Charlotte." "She is. I had not understood. I had thought—" "Yes, Mamma, I know what you had thought." "Tell her," Tell her I noticed the moss green this morning, the Indian dye. I should be glad to know how it was done." Adrian sat very still. After a moment he said, quietly, "She will tell you in her own time, Mamma. By letter, if she chooses. Not before." "I see." She went out. The Duke of Westmere sat in the muniment room for a long time after she left, with the dahlia stems at the window and the documents on the table, and the teacup steaming gently and untasted at the corner of the leather. After a long time the door opened and Charlotte came in. She did not say anything. She sat in the chair the Countess had vacated. She put her hands palm down on the leather of the table. He did not speak either. After a while, he reached across and laid his own hand over hers. "Charlotte." "Yes. I've been a bad son. I've not been a bad son to her. She did not earn good son. I've been a bad son to my father. He knew. He knew what she was. He told me, very late, when he was already so ill he could no longer rise. He said, 'Adrian, when you are master here, do not let her have the keys.' I waited 8 years. I let her have the keys. I let her have them until you came in November and asked me on the first night to take them away." "Adrian." "Yes. You did not let her have the keys for 8 years out of weakness. You let her have them out of a kindness that was perhaps misplaced but was not weak. Do not pay for kindness with shame. I shall not let you." She turned her hand under his and laced her fingers into his. They sat like that for a long time. The dahlia stems did not move at the window. The clock in the corridor struck the half-hour, and went on striking the hour, and the half-hour again. And after that they noticed the time only because Mrs. Penrose came to the door to tell them dinner had been delayed already by 20 minutes, and Mrs. Tobin was talking about her wooden spoon. The wedding was the following Tuesday, 8 days after the harvest gathering, in the parish church of Westmere St. Mary's at 11 in the morning. It was attended by the Duke, the bride's 2 aunts, the vicar, Mrs. Penrose, Mrs. Tobin, Lord and Lady Pemberton, and Wellington, who had been brought in his cage to the back of the church on the strict understanding that he would observe a vow of silence until the conclusion of the service. He observed it. He observed it through the marriage vows. He observed it through the signing of the Great Book. He observed it, magnificently, through the hymn. At the moment in which the Duke and his bride emerged from the church porch into the watery November sunlight, onto the gravelled path between the 2 long lines of tenants, Mrs. Burrows at the front with her grandson, Mr. Burrows holding his hat, Wellington was carried out by the undergroom with his cage held carefully, and at the precise moment Mrs. Burrows threw her handful of dried rose petals, Wellington remarked, with great clarity and considerable emphasis, "Position yourselves." The home farm laughed for the next 10 years. That evening, in the rose drawing room of Westmere Hall, in the firelight, in front of the portrait of the late Duke, the new Duke of Westmere stood at the hearth, with his wife in front of him, in a gown of deep violet velvet, for she had worn the ruby silk on the harvest night, and had decided that violet was the proper colour for a wedding evening. And he took her face in both hands and kissed her, properly, slowly, with the absolute disciplined patience of a man who had waited 8 long days and 3 slow weeks for the moment. And when at last he drew back, an inch, only an inch, his forehead against hers, he said, "Charlotte, I love you. I have loved you since the 2nd week, when you put the seed cake on Mrs. Tobin's deal table. I have loved you in writing for the last 10 weeks. I shall love you out loud in this house for the rest of our lives." She set her palm flat against his cheek. The firelight caught the small gold ring on her right hand, the ring her father had given her on her 21st birthday, and the new gold ring on her left, which Adrian himself had set on it that morning at the parish church. There was a small grave smile at the corner of her mouth, and her grey eyes were very steady. "Adrian," she said, "I love you. I've loved you since the kitchen. I've loved you since you bowed in front of Mary and Susan. I have loved you, in writing and out loud, the 10 weeks. I shall love you in this house, in the Rose drawing room, in the muniment room, in Burroughs Cottage, at the Sessions, in the Lords, at Bath, on the river meadow, by the great range, in front of the parrot, for the rest of our lives. There. Now you have your answer. He laughed. He kissed her again. The firelight moved. At the back of the room, on a chair drawn up by Mrs. Tobin, in defiance of every rule of decorum the marble entry had ever known, Wellington, who had been requested, by particular order of the new Duchess of Westmere, to spend his wedding night in the company of the bride and groom, which had been adjudged the only decent treatment of a parrot whose previous evening had been spent under a vow of silence, observed the kiss with grave attention, said, "Position yourselves," in a thoughtful tone, and was then, mercifully, covered with a cloth. 6 months later, in the soft May dawn, with the new green showing in the avenue and the cherry trees in flower along the south lawn, the Duchess of Westmere came down the back stair in a plain blue cotton morning gown, with her hair coiled simply at the nape, and went into the kitchen. Mrs. Tobin was at the great range, Mary was at the deal table, Susan was at the dresser. Wellington was on his perch by the window. The flagstones under her shoes were cool, the iron of the range warm against her skin, and the kitchen smelled of yeast and beeswax and a small, bright thread of wood smoke. "Good morning, Your Grace," said Mrs. Tobin. "Good morning, Mrs. Tobin. I should like to bake bread." "Your Grace?" "I should like to bake the bread for our breakfast, if you can spare a corner of the table." "I can spare you the entire table, Your Grace, but I shall not. You may have the corner." "The corner is more than enough." She washed her hands at the basin. Mary brought the brown crockery bowl and the flour. Susan brought the salt and the yeast. Mrs. Tobin brought the warm water in a small jug. Wellington, on his perch, said softly, "Tea, please," and Mary brought him a small saucer. The Duchess of Westmere set her hands to the dough. She turned it onto the floured deal, the same deal table at which, 6 months earlier, she had sat in mud-spattered indigo at Mrs. Tobin's chair with the brown teapot at her elbow. And she began, with the patient, capable hands of a woman who had been raised in a country surgery and had learned bread from a cook in Sevenoaks at the age of 9, to knead. The Duke of Westmere came into the kitchen at 7:20. He had been out at first light to look at the new mare's foal in the home farmyard. He stopped at the green baize door and looked at his wife with her sleeves turned up to the elbow and the flower on her wrists and the soft May light coming in over the great range. And he stood quite still for the time it takes a clock to strike a single note. And then he came across the flagstones and stood behind her, and laid his hand for a moment at the small of her back, very lightly, and said, "Charlotte." "Adrian." "I had a letter from Bath this morning." "And?" "My mother is well. She is at her embroidery. She has written, of all things, an apology. A short one, 2 lines. She says that she copied the moss-green dye from Sir Edmund's notebook, which she had kept for many years, and she begs your pardon for the keeping. The notebook is in the parcel. It is on the writing desk in the Rose drawing room." Charlotte did not stop kneading the dough. After a moment she said, very quietly, "That is the first thing she has given back." "It is." "Adrian." "Yes." "Tell her I shall write to her in June. Not before." "Charlotte." "Adrian." "It is sufficient." He bent and kissed the top of her head, where her hair was coiled at the nape, as he had done in the muniment room 6 months before. Then he went to the long deal table and sat down across from Mary, who was glazing the small breakfast rolls, and accepted a cup of coffee from Mrs. Tobin, and the kitchen of Westmere Hall. The kitchen which had received the new Duchess in mud-spattered indigo 6 months earlier, and given her the brown teapot, went on, in its honest and comfortable way, with the work of the morning. At the brass cage by the window, Wellington put his head on one side, looked very gravely at his duke and his duchess across the deal, and remarked with great clarity, "Tea, please." Pull your chair closer to the fire. If you have ever been mistaken in a marble hall for a lesser thing than you were, and have decided, in the long, quiet half-second that followed, not to argue with the mistake, but to outlive it, you know already what the brown teapot meant on Mrs. Tobin's deal table. If you have stayed with Charlotte, all the way from the road mud at the front door to the flower on her wrists at the Great Range, would you tell me, in the comments below, the exact moment you knew the Countess had lost? Was it the Indian shawl at breakfast, the curtsy in the barn, or the parrot at the church door? I should like to know. Subscribe if you would like another fireside in 2 days. Until then, be welcomed somewhere this week in your own kitchen.